Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Axiomatics webinar. For those of you who join us on a regular basis, you know the guidelines, but just in case, let's run through them again. Everyone is muted centrally. The webinar will be recorded and made available on the axiomatics.com website in tomorrow or later today. The slides will also be made available for download from the Axiomatics website and from our SlideShare account. And we will be saving some time at the end of the webinar today for a Q&A session. You can write questions in the questions panel of the GoToWebinar section on the right-hand side, which you can expand and minimize using the red arrow. Today's speakers are Andrew Hindle, my colleague in the United Kingdom, and myself, David Bressard, out of Stockholm, Sweden. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I forgot to mention that. And Andrew, I'll hand over to you for the agenda.
Perfect, thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us. We appreciate your time. So my name's Andy Hindle. As David indicated, I'm based in the UK. And I've been working with Axiomatics in particular on a new set of technologies and products which we'll be covering in today's presentation. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over some background in terms of what's happening with data, with big data, some of the opportunities and the challenges that are presented there. Then we're going to look a little bit at how access control, which is obviously a key part of how data is managed, exposed, used, and monetized, how access control has developed, particularly over the last 4 to 6 years. Then we'll look in detail at data filtering, talk through what that is, how it works, how it can help you. We'll finish up with some key benefits, some next steps for you to consider, and then we should have some time for questions, as David indicated, towards the end. So there's plenty of data on this. We happened to pick this particular survey from Hilbert and Lopez from back in 2011. There's plenty of other data around. It almost hardly bears repeating that data is massively on the increase. The amount of information that we capture, that we hold as organizations, and that we want to use is increasing exponentially. And along with that, access control challenges have increased pretty much at the same time. And what's happened is that over the last few years, we've moved beyond OS-specific and application-specific controls into roles-based access controls, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, until essentially the access control technologies that are available to us have developed and grown to support managing and properly controlling access to these vast amounts of data. We find this data in all sorts of interesting places. So if you imagine a typical large organization, they're going to have data about their customers, data about employees, data about suppliers and the supply chain, about distributors and distribution channels. They're going to have data that is both current but also historical, that needs to be maintained for regulated periods of time. And whilst it's certainly true, and I think people do tend to talk a lot about this data problem in the context of highly regulated industries, I think it's very clear that no industry, no organization is kind of going to be immune to this. No organization is going to escape from this. And certainly there's an awful lot of data that is specific to the internals of an organization, but there's also a huge amount of information that we're collecting from our customers. Some of that's very obvious, things like credit card numbers and financial data. Some of it's more subtle, location information, purchase history, address information that correlates with other customers. And clearly you can pull those things together if you're not careful and make deductions that might not be appropriate to make, either ethically or legally, about the customers that you're serving. Along with that growth in data, we've obviously seen a huge growth in regulation. We've picked privacy here as one example, but again, you could look at all sorts of other regulations that control how data is held and what can be done with it. And clearly complying with these rapid and significant changes in rules, in regulations, in legislation, globally, not just in one country, but across multiple jurisdictions, is again a problem that is becoming significant for organizations to think about. So one thing I don't want to do here is I don't want to spend the next 45 minutes talking about this as just a problem that needs solving. Clearly, big data is happening. We're collecting information internally and from third parties externally. That big data presents massive opportunity for organizations. And I think it's important to focus on that as well as on the challenges that that represents. And really what this is about is how can we use that data to do better business, to do business more efficiently, more effectively, to service our customers better. And how can we use that information to extend the business that we're providing, whether that's by providing new services, helping us understand how we can get into new markets, as governments perhaps understanding better what our citizens need and how we need to work with them. And so clearly along with that big opportunity comes big responsibility. Some of that responsibility is kind of externally enforced by regulation, by legislation. Some of it is also, I like to think of this as internally enforced, right? So it's ethical. We think about what's the right thing to do with the information that we have, that we hold, that we can access above and beyond what's necessarily purely required by the legislative and regulatory frameworks that we operate within. So we have all this data. The amount of data we have is increasing. The rules that govern what we can, should do with that data, who should have access to it, when, where, and how, are evolving, changing, becoming more complex. And so in order to take advantage of that big opportunity and to take advantage of it in the right way, with the right kind of responsible attitude, we need to be able to properly control, govern, report on the access that is being made to that data. So historically, the way that most organizations think about access control is they think about role-based access control, right? Very simple example, if Bob is in sales, Bob is allowed to look at his sales information about his customers, but he isn't allowed to look at, for example, other sales reps' information. He isn't allowed to look at information that might be in the product organization or in HR about his fellow employees. That's fine in a really simple world, in a really simple example like I just gave you. And in fact, for small organizations still, this is probably still an appropriate model, at least for the time being. But here's the problem. In larger organizations, roles are complicated things. There are, to start with, an awful lot of them. There's an awful lot of data that hangs off the other end, and how the role interacts with that body of information is in and of itself very complicated. But roles are also not static things, and I don't mean that in the sense of, Jane is a sales admin and then she gets promoted and now she's a sales manager. Or even the notion that somebody might move from one department to another within an organization and therefore have different roles and responsibilities. But a role really can change based on time, based on location, based on a whole range of factors. And if you try and model that as a series of static roles, you essentially get to a point where it becomes simply unmanageable. I mean, even if you just try to draw it out on a piece of paper, you'd struggle to do it, let alone being able to model an intelligent, well-worded policy and then implement that and manage it. It simply becomes impossible to do. And yet, quite apart from the fact that these are the things that we want to be able to do in order to properly enable the organizations that we work for, we're also required to do it in terms of governance and compliance and demonstrating that we are doing the right things. So what's happened is that a new set of techniques that is typically referred to as attribute-based access control has come about. And essentially what ABAC, it's the abbreviation for attribute-based access control, what ABAC does is it allows you to take account of a whole range of different factors at the point at time in which an individual is performing a particular operation, whether that's requesting some action to take place, or whether it's requesting access to a particular piece of information or a particular piece of data. So there's a whole range of attributes that you could pull in. Clearly, you can pull in who the individual is and potentially what their role is within the organization, but you can also pull in information like, what is it that they want to do? Where are they when they're making that request? It might be appropriate, for example, for a VP of sales, yes, to have access to the company's annual sales data when they're physically at the headquarters office, but maybe not when they're visiting a supplier in a foreign country, for example. We can look at when, is it appropriate to allow somebody to have access to information outside of core business hours? There's several examples happening in Germany currently where companies are saying, you know what, actually, I'm going to enforce and say my employees are not allowed to have access to, for example, email outside of the official working day. Why do they want access to the information might be something that we want to know, and how are they getting access to that? So we can look at all of those attributes in the context of an ABAC system, and then we can write fairly complex policies that will take account of that information and make a decision at this point in time. Is this request for this particular piece of information acceptable or not? And to give you a sense of, kind of how complex these things can get, and I don't normally do this, but I'll read out what it says on the slide here in the example, right? Project members may change project specification documents as long as the project is in the planning phase. Once the project is in a production phase, the project lead may change specifications if and only if there has been a change control board decision authorizing the change. So not only is that, I need to know whether an individual is or is not a project member, and I need to know what role they have within that particular project, right? Are they a project lead or just a member of the team? But I also need to get a whole bunch of information about the project itself, about what status it's in. Maybe I have to go to an entirely separate system about, to find out if a change control decision has or has not been made. And some of those systems might be outside of my control, right? I might need to go to external third-party cloud-hosted products to pull in this information at runtime and then make a decision. Clearly, this kind of complex policy control goes significantly beyond anything that anybody could do with roles-based access control. And yet, this is, in normal English, the kind of thing that people think about all the time in their daily lives. And so we need to have systems that allow us to implement this kind of policy and then to change those policies and manage them over time. So ABAC has rapidly become the accepted model for properly controlling access to information and access to operations within organizations. There's a particular standard, XACML, Extensible Attribute Control Markup Language, which currently is in its third version. And the adoption over the last particularly 2, 3, 4 years has been really significant. I'll focus here particularly on the prediction that Gartner made earlier this year. They're looking at saying that 70% of all businesses are going to be using ABAC as their primary mechanism. And that growth is going to happen here over the next few years. So this is clearly something that, if you're interested in, responsible for protecting access to data, it's something you're going to need to be thinking about now. So that brings us then to look at how does this wonderful new world of attribute-based access control mesh with the requirements that we have to protect access to data and to the increasing body of data that we hold from external third parties, from customers, and internally within the organization. So there are a lot of things that you want to try and do when you think about data protection, and I have no doubt that I haven't listed all of them here. I'm sure there are others. I was really trying to just provide a summary. But what do we want to do? We want to provide access to the right data. We want to provide access to the right person to that data, and we want to do that at the right time. And clearly the corollary to that is to make sure that we're preventing access to the incorrect data to the wrong people at the wrong time, right? In other words, we want to prevent data leakage. At the same time, we know that the requirements that the business will have, both from a regulatory standpoint, but also in terms of enabling the business, whether that's optimizing it or making the business, developing net new business for us to go into. Those requirements change, they change rapidly. The pace of change will increase and the scale of change will increase over the coming years. We need to be able to adapt to those changes extremely rapidly and to implement access policies that support those business and regulatory requirements. We also need to make sure that we can apply those policies once we've developed them across all of the applications that are under our control. And it's worth pointing out, I was a little cheeky, I said under our control, but it's often the case that applications are not fully under our control. It might be because they're legacy applications, it might be because they're third-party applications that we don't own the code for, it might be that they are entirely external cloud-based applications that we literally can't specifically control. And on top of all of that, we have to be able to demonstrate that we're doing the things that the business and that the regulatory regime that we might be operating within requires from us. Doing that is really hard. It's really hard because there are lots of different applications. It costs money. It takes time to make changes to those applications. And in many cases, companies are still working with existing access control solutions, whether those are commercially purchased products or whether they're in-house implemented or whether it's some combination of the two, which frankly is at least in my experience, most common. That those solutions were not designed for the scale and pace of change that we're dealing with today. They weren't designed to allow us to take advantage of the opportunity that's presented to us. And so that holds us back. That makes it very difficult for us to get the right protections in place to take advantage of these new opportunities. So what techniques are people mostly using? Today, combination of things. So, and again, I'm sure there are others. The primary ones that we typically encounter, encryption and hashing. So fine, how can we obfuscate, hide, protect the data using cryptography specifically within the database? Data masking, how can we retrieve data and then make it look as if it's something else so that we're not necessarily exposing the specifics of the information. And then clearly roles-based roles-based access control implemented at the application level. So there are some challenges there. Encryption has challenges. Clearly, it prevents everyone from seeing the data. That's the point. If you want anyone to be able to see the data, then you get into a whole key management mechanism, which if anyone's had to deal with that, is a real challenge and extremely expensive. It has its place. I don't want to sit here and suggest that encryption of data in a database or one-way hashing is not appropriate. Clearly it is for certain subsets of data, but it's not a generic tool that we can use across the entire estate. Masking can also be extremely useful. Masking hides the data, right? So I can retrieve, for example, a zip code, and then I can mask it either with a series of identical characters, or in some cases, with some of the more advanced solutions on the market, I can pull that data back and then mask it with something that looks like a zip code, looks like a credit card number, but isn't real. That's fine, but it's still the case that I can see that the data exists. So from a very cynical, kind of black hat perspective, it's interesting potentially to an attacker to say, well, okay, this organization, whilst the credit card information that I can see here isn't necessarily real, they clearly hold that credit card information. So that makes it a much more interesting target to me. It's also the case that masking can sometimes be used to hide data that frankly the user should never have had access to in the first place. So there are some risks there, particularly from a compliance standpoint, in terms of being able to really prove and say, yeah, this particular individual, this group, this external organization clearly did not have access to the original data. Roles-based access control as noted, restricts data to certain users, but managing that over time with the increase in roles and with the power and flexibility that we need, it just doesn't work. That's very clear, and that's why the industry's been moving in the ABAC direction. So when we think then about attribute-based access control, typical scenario is that we have individuals using applications, whether those are server-based apps, whether they're applications running locally on devices, say natively on a cell phone. Those applications are hopefully making API calls and not making SQL query requests over HTTP, although we all know that that happens. Hopefully they're making API calls back through to an application. And what typically happens is that if we want to implement attribute-based access control and get that power, that flexibility that a standard like XACML gives us, that an approach like ABAC gives us, that is implemented at the application level. Now, I'm simplifying the story a little bit here. In fact, what will typically happen is the application will then make a call out to an ABAC solution. The ABAC solution will make the decision, send that decision back. The application will come know what to do. But as we discussed earlier, that approach, whilst it works, and we have many customers today at Axiomatics that are using a variety of our products to implement solutions like that, there are some challenges with it too. The first thing is you have to change the application, right? The application now needs to make the external call and be integrated with the ABAC solution that you happen to choose. That may be very difficult to do if the applications are old. You may not own the source code for them. They may be external applications or third-party applications. There are also some soft problems associated with this. It may very well be the case, and we've run into this more than once, that application developers don't have the same concerns that as an owner of data, as an owner of information, you have about protecting that data. It's simply a lower priority for them relative to getting the application shipped on time, relative to other security concerns that they have to think about, relative to making sure that they're using the right tools, the right technologies, the right techniques, that they're scaling the application properly. These are all things they have to consider, along with your request to say, hey, by the way, we need to make sure that we're controlling access to information properly. They may just not get around to it in a time frame that's appropriate for your particular needs. As organizations grow, as organization walls become more porous, as we do more business with external parties, as we look to grow the number of mobile applications and other third-party application access that we can support, so we get a vast proliferation in the number of API calls that are happening. So that makes the problem worse. And again, those external applications that are making those requests are literally outside of your control. And you may very well be able to go to a supplier and say, hey, you need to support this particular request mechanism when you access my data. But you may not be able to do that with a distribution channel. You may not be able to do it with your business customers. You don't have control over those applications. So how do you get all of that back in a controllable state? So here's a thing to think about. Back to our application security landscape, we have our individuals using applications that are making calls via APIs, hopefully, into our applications. What if, instead of, or as well as, implementing ABAC at the application level where it typically gets implemented, what if we could push that back and implement it effectively at the database level where the data resides? So with that in mind, let's have a little look at ADAF, Axiomatics Data Access Filter, which is a product that Axiomatics brought to the market in the latter part of last year. And what ADAF allows us to do is to apply the same powerful techniques of attribute-based access control, but to do that in order to filter the data that is being returned in response to a query for information. Attribute-based data filtering. In other words, I'm filtering the data at source before it even leaves the database. I'm filtering the data, applying policies to ensure that only that data which meets the policy at that particular point in time for that particular request by that particular application or user in that particular context, that only that data that is permitted by the policy is returned from the database. It's a standards-based solution. It's based on XACML, which is the standard for attribute-based access control. It's pretty easy to deploy and maintain, consistent with the other Axiomatics family products. You can deploy it standalone, or you can deploy it as part of a broader XACML deployment, and you can clearly grow that over time, right? So you could start with a quick ADAF deployment, and then over time you can add the application level controls that you might need for other purposes. And it's designed to be part of the modern big data universe. It's high performance, it scales, and it's flexible in terms of how you scale it over time. So, what do we specifically mean by data filtering? Essentially, what we're doing here is we're taking the query, and at runtime, we are rewriting the query based on the policy and the other information that is appropriate for that particular policy enforcement. By doing that, we can ensure that only that data which the policy permits is returned from the database. And again, you can combine this with the other data protection mechanisms that we referenced earlier. So it might very well be that you're still encrypting certain data, that you're still masking certain data. You can then apply the data filtering on top of that to make sure that only that data that's relevant is being returned, even if it's already protected. One thing that I do want to clarify here is something that many people will already be familiar with, and which we have talked about a little bit, which is the notion of data masking. We get a lot of confusion about the difference between filtering and masking, so let's look at that really specifically. A mask is a fairly straightforward thing, and again, these examples are extremely basic, just so you can get a sense of what we mean, and then in your own minds you can extrapolate the very simple SQL query into something that might be a little bit more real world. But here with masking, I'm essentially selecting all of the information from my table of sales commissions in this case. What I get back, though, is some information that's been masked. In this case, it's been masked because the person making the request should not have access to commissions for the southern region. They're only allowed to see commissions for the northern sales region. So here what we're doing is we're saying, yep, I hold that data, it's available, but I'm hiding it from you. In this particular case, I'm masking it in a very basic way. I'm simply applying a series of X's. I could apply, let's say, a numerical mask to that in some way. That would be another option. The point is, though, that I can still see the rest of the data, right? I can still see that that data exists. I can still see that there's probably some value for Jane. She probably did sell something. So although it's masked, it's still been extracted from the database. With filtering, we take that a step further. What we do with filtering is that we, at runtime, based on the policy, apply an additional clause or potentially even rewrite the entire SQL query where that would be necessary. In this case, it's a very simple example, so I'm simply appending a where clause and then inserting a value that I want to filter on. In this case, I'm inserting the value that I want to filter on, the sales team being the north team rather than the southern team. So now what happens is my query has changed. I'm only returning the information from the database that is specifically permitted by the policy that's been dictated, that's been applied. I could then, if I wanted, apply an additional mask on top of that. But it's important to note that the data never left the database, right? The data that wasn't allowed to leave the database never left the database. So how do we do that architecturally? Essentially, we're doing acting as a proxy in the request flow. So the application is going to make a request for some data back to the database. We're going to intercept that with ADAF, and we're going to pull in the relevant XACML policies plus any external information that we might need to help make a policy-based decision. So that might be something as simple as what time of the day it is. It might be where is this particular user coming from? What level of authorization did they have? How did they authenticate when they originally authenticated with the application? It might be information about the data itself. It could be all sorts of things and any combination of those things. Based on that information, we can then make essentially a policy decision and adapt, change the SQL query that then gets sent back to the database. Having done that, the database can then return the filtered data back straight after the application. So again, only that data which our policy at that particular point in time permits to be extracted is extracted. We can get fairly flexible with this too. So most people are familiar with the notion of essentially filtering on a row basis. So in this particular example, we're filtering that a manager can see all the information, but only for their specific regions. And so they might be the manager of, I don't know, let's say region 1, and they'd be able to return Jane's information right the way across the row, Mike's information, Kevin's information out of that particular table example there. We can also do this though on a column basis. So we could, for example, say sales admin is allowed to see only names and regions, all names and regions, but only commissions for the region that they specifically administer. So as soon as they touch one of those particular cells that contains that information, particular columns, we can filter that out. And then clearly you can combine both of those two things to potentially even return just a single cell of information if that was appropriate for the particular policy enforcement that you wanted to do. So, quick review of the key capabilities. I mentioned this before, but the product supports XACML 3, which is the latest version of the specification. It gives you all of the power that you need to write these extremely complex policies to support the business that you have. We also support a wide range of external information stores. I've listed a couple here, LDAP and SQL. We also provide an API so that you can write adapters effectively to custom external information stores if that's necessary for your particular deployment. Today, the product supports Oracle as the target database. We're in the process of adding support for a number of others, certainly including SQL Server, and there'll probably be a few others coming in a release a little bit later on this year. And as noted earlier, we're designed to run in a big data environment. So we're fault tolerant, you can cluster the product. It's designed to be high performance when we do the query intercepts and rewrite them. And it's designed to be deployed in a large data center in a cluster with full logging capability so that you can incorporate it with your existing management and monitoring systems. So I'll finish up here with a quick summary and then some next steps for you to think about as you look to your own organizations, your own businesses, the data requirements that you have, and how you're going to manage those over the coming period of time. So again, big data, massive opportunity. It's important to act responsibly, not just to be in compliance with the regulations and the legislation, but also from an ethical standpoint, let's make sure that we're doing what's right in order to properly support, properly take advantage of in a reasonable way the opportunities that are presented to us by this vast proliferation of data. Standards-based ABAC, specifically XACML, is a key enabling platform, a key enabling technology for you as you start to develop your approaches to growing, developing in this new big data universe. You're going to want to think about quick wins to help support a longer-term strategy to implement ABAC across the organization. It's important to help business owners understand what the value of this is. And so think about, are there short, quick, limited scope projects where you could get something like ADAF deployed to really make a business impact, whether that's in terms of keeping current with policy, keeping current with legislation, or even better, helping to enable a net new business in a way that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. At the same time, don't let the application development maintenance lifecycle get in the way, right? Don't be held up by the fact that it is hard, it is challenging to update, to change applications. Sometimes it can be done, it just takes a while, but in some cases it's simply not possible to do. And yet you still want to move ahead. And that's where a solution like ADAF, being able to protect the data at source, is going to be extremely helpful. And finally, think about protecting the data at source, where it's appropriate, where it makes sense. If it doesn't need to leave the data store, it shouldn't leave the data store. And there's now powerful ways to help you do that. So that pretty much brings me to the end of the slides, and I think at this point, David, we'll open it up, see if there's been any questions.
Alrighty, thank you very much, Andy. And the very first question that just came in is actually more of an admin question. Is the presentation available for download? Yes, it will be made available for download. My colleagues from marketing will make sure it's uploaded to the right location. Moving on, another question that we have here that is rather interesting is what industry, what vertical does this technology apply to the best? And the second follow-up is which industry has picked it up already in your customer base? Do you want to take that, Andrew?
Yeah, why don't you answer it, David? I might have a couple of extra points, but why don't you go ahead?
Okay, so the one customer that I'm aware of that has picked this technology up extremely quickly and has helped us actually mature that technology is pharmaceutical. So that's the one where we see it being applied. Financial is also an area that is extremely interested in using the technology for privacy concerns. Andrew?
Yeah, and I'd add to that, David. So slightly more broadly, attribute-based access control as a whole is something that we see as a very, very horizontal solution. David's absolutely right that financial services writ large, so banking, insurance, healthcare has picked it up quite heavily, and pharmaceutical alongside of that. But actually, we see it very horizontal. It's across almost every industry. We see it in manufacturing. What's interesting with ADAF is that most organizations actually hold data. And our expectation is, and certainly based on the inquiries that we've had and the conversations that we've had in the early stages about ADAF, suggests that most verticals will have an interest in this at some level.
Thanks, Andrew. Another great question that just came in. Can ADAF handle formats other than SQL tables? For instance, graph or object-oriented databases. You want me to pick that up, Andrew?
Sure.
Okay. So right now, the Axmedix data access filter is only for relational databases, but we do have in our wish list in a long-term strategy the hope that one day we can tackle other databases such as NoSQL and graph databases. We're not there yet, so you're going to have to hang in there and be patient.
Yeah, I'd add to that if the individual that was asking the question, if they have specific requirements around that, certainly from a product development standpoint, I think the whole team would be really interested to hear more about that. So if you want to contact us, separately offline, feel free to do that. We'd love to have an open conversation just to understand those requirements a little better. It's certainly something that we've heard from other organizations. It is, as David says, something we're looking at. But the more information we can get about the specifics, the better that will be. So.
Thanks. I just want to go back to the answer regarding the financial institutions, and I want to qualify that. One of my colleagues just nudged me and pointed out that one of the top 5 global banks is actually using the Axmedix data access filter to protect its databases. Thanks, AJ. Following up on that, another question that just came in. Filter only apply at where clause? Yes, the way the Axmedix data access filter works is that we intercept the SQL statement, the select SQL statement, and we send an authorization request to the engine within the data access filter. That engine produces a where clause, which it returns to the proxy at the database, and the proxy modifies the original SQL statement and appends the where clause to create this new full-blown SQL statement that it then executes against the database. Andrew, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so will add that there are some cases where, yeah, no pun intended, where it's
I saw that.
necessary to go a little bit beyond just appending a simple where clause. So clearly, the examples I was using in the slides were very basic. There's a limit to how much space there is on a slide. We can get a little bit more intelligent than that. So again, if you've got specific requirements around that, feel free to come back to us offline. We can look at what the requirements are and talk through how we can meet them.
Okay. A couple more questions that came in. What about performance? What is the impact on the performance?
Mm-hmm. So it's a little difficult to give a hard, kind of quantifiable number on this because it clearly depends on a whole range of external factors. With that said, certainly the work that we've done with our existing customers on this, the intercept that we do typically takes minimal time, order of, milliseconds, if that. Where it gets a little bit more interesting is where you might need to get information from external sources that effectively are outside our control in order to make that policy decision. That's something and so, clearly you're reliant on those external systems and on their performance. There are some things that we do architecturally in terms of caching to try and mitigate that in various ways. And again, based on the experience that we have with our existing customers here, we know that it's possible to deploy ADAF in very high performance situations, very high performance scenarios. It's something that we'll work with our customers on during the period of time that they're looking at ADAF and presenting their requirements. We work through those and make sure the product's deployed in a way that meets those requirements. So hard to give a specific answer, but it isn't something that we've really run up against as being a significant issue.
Thanks, Andrew. Another question. How does ADAF compare with Oracle VPD? Doesn't VPD already provide the ability to protect your databases? And if so, why come up with ADAF? You want me to pick that up? Or
Sure.
Okay. So Oracle VPD stands for Virtual Private Database, is a feature of Oracle Enterprise databases, and it does provide you with the ability to define security policies that apply to tables or fields of tables. But the way you would use it to define an authorization constraint, for instance, would be through the use of PL SQL code that you would have to program on the database itself directly. And there's a couple problems with that approach. On the first hand, it requires that you have Oracle PL SQL knowledge, which you do not always have in-house. Secondly, the performance is not necessarily that great. Thirdly, it's a fairly static authorization model. And lastly, it means that you've peppered specific authorization knowledge within your Oracle VPD policies. The benefit and that makes it really hard to maintain. The benefit of using ADAF is that you use one centralized format, the XACML policies, that you manage centrally, and then based on those policies, ADAF will generate the relevant where clause dynamically at runtime.
And a couple of things, thanks, David. That was a really great answer. A couple of things to add to that. One is, most organizations that we talk to, whilst they will typically have standardized to some extent on a particular database, it's very rare, just as with operating systems, that we find any organization that only has that particular database in production. And so that's one of the reasons why I noted earlier we're adding support for a range of databases over time. To allow for that flexibility. And the second thing, to come back to the external policy approach that David was referring to, clearly, once you write and apply those policies to your data and to your data filtering, you can also repurpose those policies across the rest of the estate, which isn't something you can do if you've just got it built in to a particular database. So.
Okay. Great. Another great question that just came in is the interception implemented in process or out of process, i.e., is it an extension to the database or is it a separate executable?
It's the best way to answer that is that it's a separate executable. there is some subtlety in terms of the specifics of the implementation, which is probably not appropriate to go into in the context of this call. But again, if that's something you're particularly interested in, get in touch with us afterwards, and we'll be happy to walk through it in more detail.
Well, I'll add a couple details to that. In the way we've implemented the Axmedics data access filter, we have two approaches. One is specific to Oracle VPD, Oracle Virtual Private Database. And in that case, I would call it in process because the interceptor resides within the memory of the Oracle database. It's within that Oracle database. However, in the new version of the data access filter, we've broadened our support for other databases. We've expanded, and we've done that through a partnership with a company called Informatica. And they provide a proxy that sits in front of the database. In that case, it's a separate executable.
Thanks for the clarification, David. Appreciate that.
Sure. And also, going back to the performance question, I've just had a nudge from one of my colleagues. Again, it's important to highlight the fact that performance is decoupled from the amount of data in the database. And that's really the clear win, the clear takeaway from this technology. It no longer matters how much you want to protect, the performance will be the same. Okay, and another question here. What is the impact on the application? You're saying you're intercepting a flow between at the database level. What does it mean for the application consuming the data from the database?
Yeah, David, I lost part of that question. Do you want to just go through it again, or do you just want to answer
Sure,
it?
sure. I'll pick up the answer. The question was what happens to the application that is connecting to the database now being protected? Well, the application does not need to change. Principally. The only thing that must happen, and there's no escaping that, is that the identity of the original requester, the identity of the original user asking for the information, must be passed down from the application to the database. We need to know who was asking for the information in the first place to be able to create an authorization request. If the authorization request is tell me which documents Alice can view, we need to know we're dealing with Alice. And sometimes applications do not pass that identity down to the database. So in that case, you need to update your app such that the end user identity be passed downwards. And as it turns out, the drivers that you use to connect your applications to your databases have the means to pass this type of contextual information through configuration. So the impact, if any, is minimal. And the only impact, if any, would be the ability or the requirement that you pass the identity of the requesting user. All right. Andrew?
Yeah, no, we're good.
Okay. I'm looking here. I don't think we have any additional questions coming in. It's 10 to 5 here in continental Europe, 10 to 4 in the UK. And I'm too lazy to do the math for the US right now. My apologies. Before we give you back your precious time, first of all, we'd like to thank you for attending and thank you for these many great questions. Thank you, Andrew, for your time as well. It was really great listening to you. And we'd like to highlight the fact that we have a few events coming up between now and December. We'll be at the European Identity Conference next week. So if you're in Europe or if you're planning on attending the conference, do drop by. We'll be in booth S5. We will have a customer speaking on stage. We will have one of our colleagues, our VP of Business Development, who will be taking part in a panel on attribute-based access control versus role-based access control. I will be speaking in an Oasis workshop on privacy. So do come and see us. Later in May, we'll be organizing a Nordics breakfast seminar here in Stockholm. We will hear from one of our customers, Nordea, a leading bank in the Nordics, and how they used our product to tackle privacy challenges. Early in June, our head of operations in the United States, Jerry Gable, will be speaking at the Identity Relationship Management Summit, and that's in Phoenix, Arizona. And in July, we'll be at the Cloud Identity Summit in sunny Monterey, California, to look at the next generation trends in terms of identity access management and authorization. We'll have a workshop on the latest JSON profile of XACTWOL for the developers and you. And finally, in
I'll be
December,
across for that as well. So
sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
yeah, I was just saying I'll be at the Monterey event as it happens. So
All right,
I was just mentioning that.
great. So then you can probably run a couple demos of ADAF at the conference.
You never know, that kind of thing might happen. Yeah.
All righty, sounds great. And to top it off, in December, we will be at the Gartner Identity and Access Management Summit as usual, and that will be in Las Vegas, Nevada. And we will be filling the list with additional webinars and additional events, so stay tuned. Do check out our website at axionetics.com/events. On this note, everyone, we'd like to thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, David. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time.